The Japanese fighter pilots knew something had changed the moment they heard it. A sound that cut through the humid Pacific air like a knife through silk. It wasn't the familiar drone of their own engines. It wasn't the rumble of American bombers they'd grown used to intercepting. This was different. This was the sound of death itself, screaming toward them at over 400 miles per hour. The bent-winged devil had arrived in the Pacific, and with it came the end of everything the Imperial Japanese Navy had built in the air. Before we witness the moment when Japan's greatest weapon met its match, we must understand what ruled these skies. From late 1941 through most of 1942, no aircraft in the world could challenge the Mitsubishi A6M-0. Its pilots were artists of destruction, men who had learned their craft in the skies over China. Veterans who could make their machines dance through turns that would tear other fighters apart. At places like Rabaul, 700 of these fighters waited like coiled springs. Each pilot had hundreds of hours of combat experience. Each had killed before. Each believed absolutely in his superiority over any machine the Americans could field. The Zero itself seemed almost alive in skilled hands. Weighing barely 5,000 pounds, it could climb faster than anything else in the sky. It could turn inside any American fighter. It could stay aloft for hours while enemy planes ran low on fuel and limped home. For over a year, this combination of machine and man had carved through American formations like a sword through paper. But perfection carries a price. The Zero's incredible agility came from its lightweight construction. No armor protected the pilot's back. No self-sealing fuel tanks prevented fires. Every bullet that found its mark often meant instant death. The Americans were learning. They were watching. They were planning something the Japanese could never imagine. In corporate boardrooms and military planning sessions back in America, engineers and strategists knew they needed more than incremental improvements. They needed a revolution. Something that could not just match the Zero, but overwhelm it completely. The answer would come from an unlikely source, a machine so dangerous that the Navy initially refused to put it on their carriers. The story begins in 1938, when American designers sat down to create the impossible. They wanted a fighter that could fly faster than anything in the world. They wanted guns that could saw an enemy plane in half with a single burst. They wanted armor that could stop enemy bullets without flinching. What they created was a monster. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine produced more raw power than any aircraft engine America had ever built. 18 cylinders delivered over 2,000 horsepower. But that power came with problems. The massive engine required a 13-foot propeller. Such a huge propeller would strike the ground during takeoffs and landings unless the designers found a solution. Their answer changed aviation history. The inverted gull wing. Bent downward, then upward again, it gave the new fighter a silhouette like nothing else in the sky. A predator's profile that would soon terrorize enemy pilots across the Pacific. The prototype first flew on May 29, 1940. Test pilots pushed it past 400 miles per hour on its maiden flight. No American fighter had ever flown that fast. The dream was becoming reality, but dreams in wartime must survive more than test flights. The new fighter carried 650 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 in each wing. Together they could fire 80 rounds per second. Enough firepower to destroy any aircraft with a brief trigger pull. On paper, the specifications were incredible. In practice, the machine was nearly uncontrollable. Its long nose blocked the pilot's forward vision during landing approaches. The landing gear was too stiff, causing the fighter to bounce violently on carrier decks. At low speeds, the left wing would stall before the right, snapping the aircraft into deadly rolls. Pilots started calling it the Ensign Eliminator. Young naval aviators were dying before they ever saw combat. The Navy banned it from carriers. For most aircraft, such a rejection would mean the end. But desperate times create unexpected opportunities. The Marine Corps was fighting for its life in the Solomon Islands. They had no carriers to worry about, only airfields carved from jungle and coral. They needed something that could take on the Zero and win. VMF 124 became the first squadron chosen to fly the bent-winged beast. Their pilots came from every corner of America. Farm boys who had never seen an ocean before the war. College students who had abandoned plans for law or medicine. Mechanics who understood engines but had never flown fighters. Among them was Kenneth Walsh, a mechanic from New Jersey who had enlisted at 17. He knew the sound of metal under stress. He understood the fine line between power and destruction. To him, the new fighter wasn't something to fear. It was a weapon to master. Training was brutal. The fighter demanded absolute respect. One careless moment, one mistake in judgment, and it would kill without mercy. 7 aircraft were lost to accidents in the first month alone. But the survivors learned something extraordinary. When properly handled, this machine was unstoppable. It climbed like a rocket ship. It dove at speeds that would tear other fighters apart. It absorbed punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. Each flight became a battle between pilot and machine. Each victory in that battle meant another aviator ready for the real war ahead. By February 1943, everything was ready. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the balance of power in the Pacific. Japanese pilots still believed their Zero was invincible. American Marines were about to prove them wrong. February 12, 1943. Henderson Field lay quiet in the pre-dawn darkness. Dew covered the coral runway like diamonds in the moonlight. Along the flight line, 24 dark shapes waited. Their bent wings cast strange shadows in the pale light. These were not the familiar profiles of Wildcats or P-40s. These were something new, something that looked dangerous, even sitting still. Major William Giza checked his watch. In 2 hours, these F-4U Corsairs would launch on their first combat mission in the Pacific Theater. Not a training flight, not a routine patrol. A real mission deep into enemy territory where the legendary Zero still ruled supreme. The mission briefing had been simple. Escort a PBY Catalina flying boat to Sandfly Bay. Pick up 2 downed American airmen. Bring them home safely. It sounded routine, but in wartime, no mission is ever routine. At 0800 hours, engines roared to life. The sound was unlike anything heard before at Henderson Field. Deeper than a Wildcat, more powerful than a P-40. The Pratt and Whitney double Wasp engines didn't just run. They thundered. They announced to anyone listening that something new had arrived in the Pacific. One by one, the Corsairs lifted off. Their propellers carved the humid air into thunder. Behind them, dust swirled across the coral strip. Ahead of them lay the vast blue expanse of the Solomon Sea. And somewhere out there, Zero fighters waited. At 18,000 feet, the Corsairs spread into formation. Below them, the slow Catalina lumbered along at 2,000 feet. Vulnerable, defenseless, an easy target for any Japanese fighter that might appear. The Marines scanned the horizon. Empty blue sky stretched in every direction. Then Walsh's voice crackled over the radio. "Bandits! 8 o'clock low! Climbing!" 9 Zero fighters rose from the southeast. Veteran pilots, most likely from Rabaul or Balalai. Men who had already killed many times before. The myth of Japanese air supremacy flew with them. They climbed confidently toward the American formation. They had done this before. They expected to do it again. Walsh rolled his Corsair inverted. The Pacific Ocean appeared above him where the sky should be. He pulled back hard on the stick. The fighter dropped into a screaming dive. Behind him, 11 other Corsairs followed. The formation fell from the sky like stones dropped from heaven. The airspeed indicator surged past 350 miles per hour, then 400, then 425. At such speeds, the Zero could not follow. Its wings would rip free under the tremendous strain. The Japanese pilots watched in growing alarm as the Americans plunged toward them faster than any fighter should be able to fly. Walsh steadied his gun sight on the lead Zero. The enemy aircraft filled the reticle perfectly. He pressed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns roared as one. A stream of incendiary rounds tore into the Zero's fragile frame. There was no explosion, no fireball. The Japanese fighter simply disintegrated, as if crushed by an invisible hammer. The pilot never had a chance to escape. Walsh pulled up hard. G-forces slammed him into his seat. Above him, more Corsairs followed the same deadly pattern. They slashed through the Japanese formation like swords through silk, diving, firing, climbing away before the enemy could react. The Zeros tried desperately to turn and fight, but the Corsairs refused to play that game. They fought vertically, not horizontally. They used speed and altitude instead of agility. In the space of 4 minutes, the hunters became the hunted. 3 Japanese fighters fell in flames. Not one Corsair was hit. Not one was lost. The surviving Zeros fled south toward their base. Behind them, the American formation reformed around the slow Catalina. The rescue mission continued as planned. When those Japanese survivors reached Rabaul that evening, their debriefing was grim. The enemy had unleashed something new, something faster than anything they had seen, something with firepower that could tear a Zero apart with a single burst. Their report was stark. Encountered new American fighter, superior speed, exceptional firepower, cannot engage in traditional turning combat. Armor negates 7.7 millimeters effectiveness. Request immediate intelligence. Within days, a name began to spread through Japanese air bases across the South Pacific. The bent-winged aircraft that screamed during its dives became known as Whistling Death. From that moment forward, the balance of power in the Solomon skies began to shift. The weeks following that first encounter became a campaign of methodical destruction. Every morning, Corsairs lifted off from Henderson Field. Every evening, fewer Japanese aircraft returned to their bases. The myth of Zero invincibility was cracking like ice in spring. March brought larger battles. April brought massacres. On April 1st, Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh led 4 Corsairs against 30 Zeros over the Russell Islands. In another time, such odds would have meant certain death for the Americans. But times had changed. Walsh kept his flight high. They waited with the patience of predators. The Zeros climbed toward them, straining against gravity, hanging on their propellers at the edge of stall speed. That was the moment Walsh had been waiting for. The Corsairs dove. One after another, they slashed downward like hawks stooping on prey. Guns blazed. Tracers lit the sky like deadly fireworks. Before the Japanese pilots could recover, the Americans were climbing again, untouched, unbeaten. In 7 minutes, Walsh destroyed 3 enemy fighters. His wingman claimed 2 more. When the smoke cleared, 11 Zeros were falling toward the sea. Not a single Corsair had been lost. The balance of power hadn't just shifted. It had reversed completely. But the transformation wasn't measured only in aircraft destroyed. It was measured in terror. Japanese pilots, who had once flown with absolute confidence, now listened for the sound that meant death was approaching. The whistle of air rushing through the Corsair's wing roots during a dive. A banshee scream that announced the arrival of destruction. They called it whistling death, for good reason. The sound carried for miles. Ground troops learned to recognize it too. That scream overhead was the prelude to machine gun fire, to bombs dropped with surgical precision. Veterans wrote in diaries about sleepless nights spent listening for the sound that meant the Reaper was circling overhead. By June 1943, the scale of battle reached epic proportions. Over Guadalcanal, 32 Corsairs from 4 Marine squadrons rose to intercept more than 100 Japanese aircraft. Bombers and fighters pushing south to crush the American foothold once and for all. What followed was slaughter on an industrial scale. Corsairs dove into the formation with speeds no Japanese aircraft could match. Zeros twisted desperately, trying to bring their superior turning ability to bear. But the Americans never lingered long enough to be caught. Dive, fire, climb. Again and again and again. When the battle ended, 77 Japanese aircraft were gone. Only 6 Corsairs had been lost. A kill ratio of more than 13-1. Not combat. Execution. Japanese ace Tatsugu Tanemitsu survived that battle. His report, back to headquarters, was devastating. The new American fighters do not fight as we do. They strike from above like hawks, fire their terrible guns, climb away before we can react. Our Zero is no longer superior. We are being slaughtered by an enemy we cannot catch and cannot escape. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical losses. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots entered combat expecting defeat. Some began feigning illness to avoid flying against Corsairs. Others took to the air with fatalistic acceptance, knowing they would not return home. Then came the Black Sheep, VMF 214, led by Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. A squadron forged from misfits and rejects. Pilots who had been passed over by other units. Men with discipline problems or checkered histories. But in their Corsairs, they became executioners of the air. In just 84 days of combat, the Black Sheep destroyed 97 Japanese aircraft. They lost only 12 of their own. Their tactics were simple and brutal. Stay high. Stay fast. Never give the enemy a predictable target. September 16, 1943. Boyington led 24 Corsairs over Balali Airfield. 50 Zeros rose to meet them. The odds were daunting, but Boyington had taught his men one fundamental truth. In a Corsair, altitude was life. Speed was survival. Firepower was victory. The battle exploded into a 3-dimensional ballet of death. Corsairs dove from the sun, their guns spitting streams of fire. Zeros tried to climb and turn, but they bled energy too quickly against such aggressive tactics. One after another, they fell from the sky like broken birds. By the time the Black Sheep returned to base, 20 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Not a single Corsair had been lost. Boyington himself claimed 5 kills in that single engagement. An ace in a day. A feat that would have been impossible in any other American fighter. At Rabaul, the fortress of Japan's South Pacific air power, the truth could no longer be hidden. Daily reports arrived telling the same story. Pilots killed. Formations annihilated. Aircraft destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Commanders began withdrawing their most experienced aviators, sending them back to Japan to train new recruits. But the replacements arrived with barely 60 hours of flight time. Boys sent against killers flying the deadliest machine in the Pacific theater. The outcome was predictable and tragic. Japanese diaries from this period tell a story of growing despair. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi, one of the few surviving aces, wrote bitterly, "Today I watched 12 of our fighters engage 8 American Corsairs. Within minutes, 9 of ours were burning. I did not attempt to help. What could one more zero do? The war in the air is lost. We are already dead. Our bodies simply have not realized it yet." The technical reasons for Japanese defeat were clear and undeniable. The Corsair could dive at speeds the Zero could not match without structural failure. Its armor plating stopped 20 mm cannon shells that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Its self-sealing fuel tanks refused to catch fire from incendiary rounds. Its 6 Browning machine guns could shred an enemy fighter into fragments with a single burst. But the greater truth was psychological. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, American pilots entered combat with absolute confidence in their equipment and tactics. Japanese pilots, meanwhile, flew missions with growing certainty of death. The myth of the Zero was dying, and with it, the soul of Japan's naval air arm was bleeding away into the Pacific sky. Summer 1943 and into 1944 brought the climax of the Corsair story, written not in official reports, but in fire and smoke, in wreckage falling into tropical seas, in the whistle of death itself screaming down from above. For American forces, the message was unmistakable. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted decisively. For Japanese commanders, the reality was darker still. Air superiority, the very foundation of their island empire, was slipping away like sand through their fingers. When the gun smoke cleared and the contrails faded from Pacific skies, the consequences of the Corsair's dominance became impossible to ignore. This bent-winged predator had not merely won individual battles. It had rewritten the fundamental rules of air warfare in the Pacific theater. By late 1943, Rabaul was no longer a launching pad for Japanese operations. It had become a prison. 5 major airfields lay in ruins, their runways cratered by repeated bombing attacks. Simpson Harbor, once filled with proud Japanese warships, had become a graveyard of twisted metal. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers stationed there found themselves cut off from resupply, stranded and forgotten as the war moved inexorably westward toward Japan itself. The Corsair had been the primary weapon that severed those vital supply lines. For the Japanese Navy, the human cost was devastating beyond measure. The cream of their aviators, men trained for years in the art of aerial combat, men who had mastered their Zeros like samurai with their swords, were gone. Over 2,000 naval aviators died in the Solomon Islands campaign alone. Each loss represented far more than a simple statistic. Each dead pilot had been an instructor, a leader, an irreplaceable reservoir of combat experience. In their place came teenagers rushed through abbreviated training programs. Some had never fired their guns in live practice. They were sent into combat against hardened American squadrons flying aircraft that forgave no mistakes. The mathematics of aerial warfare had become inexorable. American pilots, once hesitant and defensive, were now confident hunters. The Corsair gave them speed to escape when outnumbered, armor to survive when hit, firepower to kill with absolute certainty. It transformed average aviators into aces, and aces into legends. For United States strategy, the effects rippled far beyond the Solomon Islands chain. The island-hopping campaign across the Central Pacific could never have succeeded without complete air superiority. Every amphibious landing at New Georgia, Bougainville, and the Marshall Islands was protected by Corsair squadrons overhead. Every supply convoy that braved Japanese-controlled waters sailed beneath the protective umbrella of bent-winged fighters. Where once the Zero had dictated the terms and timing of Pacific battles, now the Corsair guaranteed American dominance in any engagement. Naval strategy itself was forced to evolve. Japan had prepared for a decisive fleet engagement, a climactic clash where Zeros would cripple American aircraft carriers before they could launch effective strikes. But that battle never materialized. Instead, American air power systematically isolated Japanese strongholds, neutralized them without costly ground invasions, moved ever closer to the Japanese home islands while avoiding the massive casualties that direct assault would have required. The Corsair was revealed to be more than simply a fighter aircraft. It was a strategic weapon. A precision instrument that carved Japan's Pacific Empire into manageable pieces that could be conquered or bypassed as circumstances dictated. On the American home front, newspaper headlines told an increasingly triumphant story. Photographs of grinning Corsair pilots posed beside their bent-winged machines appeared in publications from New York to Los Angeles. Stories of aces like Kenneth Walsh, Robert Hansen, and Pappy Boyington fueled civilian morale. America had found its heroes in the Pacific skies. More importantly, it had found its weapon of vengeance for Pearl Harbor. The bent-winged devil was settling old scores with compound interest. In Tokyo, military planners watched their empire crumble from the air downward. Reports from forward commanders grew increasingly desperate. They urged new tactics, new aircraft designs, anything that might stem the relentless tide of American air superiority. But Japanese industry could not keep pace with the demands of modern air warfare. Factories lacked essential raw materials. Training programs lacked sufficient time to produce competent pilots. Most critically of all, the Corsairs never stopped coming. By early 1944, the statistical evidence painted an undeniable picture. In just 1 year of intensive combat operations, Corsair squadrons had destroyed more than 600 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 80 of their own machines. An 11-to-1 kill ratio that represented not combat, but systematic execution. The aftermath extended beyond mere strategic considerations into the realm of psychology and morale. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese pilots climbed into their cockpits, expecting defeat rather than victory. The invincible spirit that had carried them from Pearl Harbor to Singapore was broken as surely as their aircraft were shot down. Some aviators began developing mysterious illnesses to avoid combat missions against Corsairs. Others flew with fatalistic resignation, leaving final letters for families they knew they would never see again. The myth of Japanese invincibility in the air had been shattered by the reality of American industrial might and tactical innovation. For American forces, the Corsair represented something far more significant than a successful weapons system. It symbolized the turning of the tide, the moment when defensive desperation transformed into offensive confidence, when retreat became advance and survival became victory. For Japanese defenders, the bent-winged devil marked the beginning of the end, the first crack in the facade of imperial invincibility that would eventually bring their empire crashing down in ruins. The legacy of the Corsair extended far beyond its initial combat debut in the Solomon Islands. As the Pacific War progressed, this remarkable aircraft proved its versatility across multiple theaters and mission profiles. In the Philippines campaign of 1944, Marine Corsair squadrons finally succeeded in operating from aircraft carriers. The Ensign Eliminator, that had been banned from flight decks due to landing difficulties, had been tamed through improved pilot training and minor design modifications. Over Leyte Gulf, Corsairs protected invasion fleets, bombed Japanese defensive positions, and intercepted kamikaze attacks with devastating effectiveness. At Okinawa in 1945, Corsairs became specialized hunters of desperation. Japanese commanders were throwing everything they had at the American fleet in massive kamikaze attacks. Hundreds of suicide aircraft dove toward American ships every day. Corsair pilots developed new tactics specifically designed to intercept these desperate attacks before they could reach their targets. For sailors watching from ship decks below, the scream of Corsairs overhead no longer represented terror. It meant salvation was approaching at 400 miles per hour. The aircraft's combat career did not end with Japan's surrender. In Korea, Corsairs flew 80% of all U.S. Navy and Marine close air support missions. The F-4U-5 variant, equipped with a more powerful engine and strengthened airframe, could carry 4,000 pounds of ordnance. It fought not as an air superiority fighter, but as a relentless ground attack weapon, destroying tanks, bridges, and supply convoys with surgical precision. The Korean conflict even produced the Navy's last propeller-driven ace, proving that the bent-winged Devil still possessed lethal teeth even in the jet age. French naval aviators flew Corsairs in Indochina. Latin American air forces operated them for decades after World War II ended. In 1969, during the brief but savage soccer war between Honduras and El Salvador, Corsairs clashed with each other in the last piston-engine dogfights in aviation history. 3 decades after its first flight, the Predator was still hunting. But the aircraft's legacy extended beyond its combat record into the realm of memory and meaning. Japanese survivors gave it names that blended fear with grudging respect. Whistling Death, Bent-Wing Devil, the Scream from Above. These were not merely descriptive terms, but acknowledgments of a weapon that had fundamentally altered the course of the war. American veterans remembered their Corsairs with deep affection mixed with healthy respect. This was the machine that had carried them from defensive desperation to offensive dominance, from fear of the Zero to mastery of Pacific skies. It had been both protector and avenger, shield and sword. For aviation engineers and designers, the Corsair became a symbol of successful innovation under pressure. Proof that radical design concepts and raw mechanical power could change the trajectory of world history when properly applied. Its inverted gull wing and massive engine represented a willingness to challenge conventional thinking in pursuit of superior performance. Even Emperor Hirohito, in his post-war reflections on Japan's defeat, acknowledged 3 primary factors that had doomed his empire: American industrial capacity, the atomic bomb, and the Corsair fighter. When the skies could no longer be contested, he wrote, our islands became indefensible. The Corsair was the sword that severed our empire's lifeline to the outside world. Perhaps the most poignant assessment came from Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace. The Zero was like a rapier, he observed years later. Light, agile, deadly in skilled hands. The Corsair was like a broadsword, heavy, powerful, crushing everything before it. The Americans had 10 broadswords for every rapier we possessed, and they did not need to be samurai warriors to wield them effectively. This comparison captured the essential difference between Japanese and American approaches to air warfare. Japan had crafted an exquisite weapon that required years of training to master. America had built a devastating instrument that could transform ordinary pilots into deadly predators within months. The Corsair story represents more than aviation history. It embodies the collision between traditional military thinking and industrial-age warfare, between individual skill and technological superiority, between the artistry of combat and the mathematics of mass production. On September 2, 1945, when Japanese officials signed surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Corsairs flew in the overhead formation. Their bent-winged shadows crossed the same waters where the rising sun flag had once seemed invincible. It was a silent but unmistakable message about how completely the balance of power had shifted. The age of the Zero was over. The age of American air dominance had begun, and it had been written in the Pacific sky by the whistle of death itself, screaming down from above at 400 miles per hour. In the end, the Corsair had proven that in modern warfare, superior technology wielded by determined pilots could overcome even the most skilled opponents flying inferior equipment. It was a lesson that would echo through military aviation for generations to come. The bent-winged devil had not merely won battles or campaigns. It had fundamentally altered the nature of air combat itself.